So I think we can all agree that Italy's performance in World War II was not exactly their finest hour. But when we think about Italian failures in the war, we tend to focus on military incompetence, poor equipment, or Mussolini's delusions of grandeur. What often gets overlooked is just how spectacularly Italy managed to betray essentially everyone they came into contact with during the conflict, allies and enemies alike. And I mean that quite literally. By the time the dust settled in 1945, Italy had broken faith with the Germans, the British, the French, their own colonial subjects, and even themselves. It's actually quite an impressive achievement when you think about it. So in this video, I want to examine how Italy became the least reliable partner in a war absolutely stuffed with unreliable partners, and more importantly, why this happened. Because the story of Italian betrayal in World War II isn't just about opportunism or cowardice. It's about a fascist regime that fundamentally misunderstood both its own capabilities and the nature of modern warfare, leading to a cascading series of broken promises that would reshape the entire Mediterranean theater and ultimately contribute to the Axis defeat. Now, before we get into the specific betrayals, we need to understand where Italy was positioned in 1940, because the decisions Mussolini made only make sense, or rather fail to make sense, in that context. Italy had spent the 1930s trying to rebuild its international prestige after what Mussolini saw as the humiliation of World War I, when Italy had technically won, but felt cheated of promised territorial gains. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the intervention in Spain, the annexation of Albania in 1939. These were all attempts to prove that fascist Italy was a great power, deserving of respect and empire. But here is the fundamental problem. Italy's military and industrial capacity simply could not support Mussolini's ambitions. The Italian economy was roughly 1/6 the size of Britain's and 1/8 the size of Germany's. Italian steel production in 1940 was about 2.3 million tons, compared to Britain's 13 million and Germany's 19 million. The Italian Navy, often praised as the one competent service, had exactly 0 aircraft carriers and severe fuel shortages. The Air Force was flying biplane fighters that would have looked dated in 1935, and the Army had artillery from World War I, inadequate anti-tank weapons, and a logistics system that would charitably be described as hopeful. So when Mussolini decided to enter World War II in June 1940, he was making a bet that the war would be over in weeks, and that he could grab some territorial spoils without having to fight a prolonged conflict. That brings us to the first major betrayal, and it is one that often gets forgotten because of how the war developed. Italy betrayed France. Now you might say, well, obviously they declared war on France. That is not a betrayal. That is just war. But here's the thing. As late as May 1940, France and Italy were not at war. The French had spent considerable effort trying to keep Italy neutral, offering territorial concessions, economic agreements, anything to avoid opening a second front. Mussolini had actually assured the French multiple times through diplomatic channels that Italy had no immediate intention of entering the conflict. Then on June 10th, 1940, with France already reeling from the German invasion, with Paris about to fall, with the French army in full retreat, Mussolini declared war. As Roosevelt memorably put it, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor. The Italian invasion of France was launched on June 21st, 1940, just 4 days before the French surrender. The Italians attacked with 32 divisions against 6 French divisions, and despite this overwhelming numerical advantage, they advanced roughly 100 yards in most places. The French Alpine troops held them off with almost contemptuous ease, but that is not the point. The point is that Mussolini waited until France was already defeated before attacking, purely to claim a seat at the peace table. This was not war, it was opportunistic scavenging, and it established a pattern that would define Italian strategy for the next 3 years. Jump in when victory seems certain, grab what you can, hope nobody notices your actual contribution is minimal. The next betrayal was of Greece. and this one would have far more serious consequences for the Axis war effort. In October 1940, Mussolini decided to invade Greece from Albania, partly to prove that Italy could have its own victories independent of Germany, and partly because he was jealous of German successes in the Balkans. Now here is where the betrayal element comes in. Italy and Greece had signed a non-aggression pact. The Italian invasion was launched without warning, without any real provocation, and without informing Germany, Italy's main ally. Mussolini apparently wanted to present Hitler with a fait accompli to show that Italy too could conduct successful blitzkrieg operations. As you can imagine, this did not go well. The Greeks not only stopped the Italian invasion, they counterattacked and drove the Italians back into Albania, inflicting humiliating defeats on a force that was supposed to be representing the new Roman Empire. The Italian army lost over 13,000 dead and 50,000 wounded in the first 3 months of fighting. Mussolini had to beg Hitler for help. The consequences of this betrayal of Greece were enormous. Hitler had to divert forces to bail out the Italians in the Balkans, which delayed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, by several crucial weeks. Those weeks, many historians argue, made the difference between capturing Moscow in 1941 and the German army getting bogged down in winter warfare it was completely unprepared for. So Mussolini's opportunistic betrayal of Greece did not just fail on its own terms, it potentially changed the entire course of the war in the East. But perhaps the most consequential betrayal was of Germany itself, and this happened in stages over 1943. Let us be clear about the relationship between Italy and Germany. It was never an equal partnership. Germany was overwhelmingly the stronger power, but there was at least a pretense that this was an alliance of ideological brothers, fellow fascist states building a new European order. The Pact of Steel signed in 1939 committed Italy and Germany to mutual military support. Italian propaganda constantly emphasized the bond between the two nations, and then, in July 1943, the Italians essentially stabbed the Germans in the back. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 exposed just how hollow Italian military resistance had become. Within 2 weeks, Mussolini was deposed in a palace coup. The new Italian government, under Marshal Badoglio, immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies, all while publicly assuring the Germans that Italy would continue fighting. For 6 weeks, the Italian government maintained this charade, telling the Germans they were preparing new defensive positions while actually arranging the terms of Italian surrender. When the armistice was announced on September 8th, German forces in Italy were caught completely off guard. Entire Italian divisions simply dissolved. The Italian fleet sailed to Malta to surrender to the British. Italian troops who had been fighting alongside the Germans in the Balkans, in Greece, in southern France suddenly became either prisoners or partisans. The Germans had to rush reinforcements to Italy, disarm their former allies, and defend the entire Italian peninsula by themselves. Now you might argue this was not a betrayal. This was Italy recognizing reality and getting out of a war it could not win. And there is some truth to that. But the manner in which it was done, the deception, the secret negotiations while German soldiers were still dying alongside Italian troops, the complete abandonment of any loyalty to their ally, this was betrayal by any reasonable definition. And it gets worse. The Italian surrender was so badly coordinated that it left Italian soldiers stranded all over Europe with no clear orders. In Greece, in Yugoslavia, in southern France, Italian divisions suddenly found themselves surrounded by Germans who now viewed them as enemies. Thousands of Italian soldiers were executed by the Germans, most infamously on the island of Kefalonia, where the Germans massacred over 5,000 Italian troops who refused to surrender their weapons. The Italian government had betrayed not just Germany, but its own soldiers, leaving them to face the consequences of decisions made in Rome. This is where it gets even more complicated. Italy then proceeded to betray the allies it had just surrendered to. The armistice terms required Italy to cooperate with Allied forces and to turn over military assets. The new Italian government was paranoid about appearing too pro-Allied, worried about domestic political reaction, and about German forces still occupying most of the country. They dragged their feet, supplied incomplete information about German positions, delayed turning over their fleet, and generally proved almost as unreliable as allies as they had been as enemies. The British and Americans were constantly frustrated by Italian failures to provide promised support. Italian partisans fought bravely against the Germans, and that is absolutely true. But the Italian government itself remained slippery and evasive, trying to minimize its obligations while maximizing its post-war territorial claims. As one British officer put it, "We have exchanged useless allies for slightly less useless co-belligerents." But wait, there is more, because we must also talk about how Italy carried out a systematic betrayal of its colonial subjects. Italy had colonies in East Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland, plus Libya and North Africa. These territories had been conquered with considerable brutality. Mussolini used poison gas in Ethiopia. Collective punishments were routine, and colonial populations were treated as inferior races fit only for exploitation. When war came, Italy conscripted colonial troops with promises of fair treatment and post-war benefits. These troops fought for Italy in East Africa, in North Africa, and even in the Soviet Union, where an entire corps of colonial soldiers was sent to the Eastern Front. And then, when Italy surrendered, these soldiers were simply abandoned. The Italian government made no provisions for them in the armistice negotiations. Colonial troops in East Africa found themselves prisoners of the British, with no country willing to claim responsibility for them. Colonial soldiers on the Eastern Front were left to fend for themselves, many dying in Soviet prison camps. The promises of citizenship, of land, of recognition, all evaporated. Italy had used these men as cannon fodder and then discarded them without a second thought. There's also the question of how Italy betrayed itself, which might sound odd, but bear with me. The fascist regime had built its entire legitimacy on the idea of national renewal, of restoring Italy to greatness, of creating a new Roman Empire. Mussolini promised the Italian people that fascism would make them strong, disciplined, feared, and respected. Instead, his reckless ambitions led Italy into a catastrophic war it was completely unprepared for. Over 500,000 Italian soldiers died in World War II. Italian cities were bombed, the economy was shattered, and the country was occupied and fought over for 2 years. The social contract between the fascist regime and the Italian people, such as it was, promised glory in exchange for obedience. What it delivered was humiliation, destruction, and occupation. In that sense, Mussolini's regime betrayed the fundamental trust of the nation it claimed to represent. The Italian people were betrayed by their own government's incompetence and delusion. Now let's talk about why all this happened, because it's not enough to just catalog the betrayals. We need to understand the underlying causes. I think there are at least 4 major factors that explain Italy's pattern of unreliability during World War II. First, there was the fundamental mismatch between Mussolini's ambitions and Italy's capabilities. Mussolini genuinely believed that will and ideological fervor could overcome material limitations. He thought that fascist Italy could compete with Britain and Germany through sheer determination. This was not just propaganda, he seems to have actually believed it, but reality does not care about your ideology. When Italian tanks broke down because they were mechanically unreliable, when Italian ships could not sortie because they lacked fuel, when Italian divisions collapsed because they lacked artillery support, no amount of fascist rhetoric made any difference. This gap between ambition and capability meant that Italy was constantly making promises it could not keep, entering conflicts it could not win, and then having to find ways to escape the consequences. Second, there was the problem of regime survival versus national interest. Mussolini's primary concern was always maintaining his own power and the prestige of fascism. Strategic decisions were made based on what would shore up domestic political support, not what was militarily sound. The invasion of Greece, for example, made no military sense, but it made political sense if you were Mussolini trying to prove you did not need Hitler's help. Similarly, the decision to remain in the war, even when it was clearly hopeless, was driven by Mussolini's fear that making peace would mean the end of fascism and his own political career. When those calculations shifted in 1943, when keeping Mussolini became more dangerous to regime survival than removing him, The new Italian government had no loyalty to Germany because the alliance had always been based on convenience, not principle. Third, there was a cultural and institutional problem within the Italian military. The Italian officer corps was often promoted based on political loyalty rather than competence. There was a pervasive culture of telling superiors what they wanted to hear rather than accurate reporting. This meant that Mussolini was consistently given overly optimistic assessments of Italian military strength. When he made the decision to enter the war in June 1940, he believed his own propaganda about Italian military might. The result was a spiral of failure, false reporting, more ambitious plans to compensate, more failure, and eventually complete collapse of institutional cohesion. An army that cannot tell its own leadership the truth is an army that cannot function, and an army that cannot function becomes unreliable in every sense of the word. Fourth, and perhaps the most important factor, Italy was trying to fight a great power war with a regional power, military, and economy. There is a concept in military history of strategic overstretch, where a nation commits to obligations it cannot possibly fulfill. Italy took strategic overstretch to an almost artistic level. They were simultaneously trying to fight in North Africa, in East Africa, in the Balkans, in the Soviet Union, and in the Mediterranean, all while defending the Italian homeland. No nation with Italy's limited resources could have sustained this. The result was that Italian forces were everywhere inadequate, everywhere overstretched, and everywhere vulnerable. When you are that overextended, retreat and betrayal become not choices, but necessities. You simply cannot maintain your positions or honor your commitments because you lack the physical means to do so. All of these factors combined to create a situation where betrayal became almost systematic. Italy made promises to Germany it could not keep because it lacked the military capacity. It made surprise attacks on neighbors because it needed quick victories to maintain domestic support. It eventually abandoned its ally because continuing to fight would mean regime destruction. At every stage, short-term political and survival calculations trumped any sense of strategic reliability or alliance loyalty. And this is what makes Italy's case in World War II so instructive. It is not that Italians as individuals were more prone to betrayal than anyone else. It is that the structural contradictions of the fascist regime made consistent, reliable strategic behavior essentially impossible. So hopefully I've persuaded you that Italy's pattern of betrayal during World War II was more than just occasional opportunism. It was a systematic consequence of a regime that was fundamentally mismatched with the war it had chosen to fight. Italy betrayed France by attacking when victory was already certain. It betrayed Greece by breaking a non-aggression pact and launching an unprovoked invasion. It betrayed Germany by secretly negotiating surrender while maintaining the pretense of alliance. It betrayed the Allies by being an unreliable partner after switching sides. It betrayed its colonial subjects by abandoning them after using them as soldiers. And it betrayed its own people by leading them into a catastrophic war based on delusions of grandeur. The consequences of these betrayals were profound, not just for Italy, but for the entire course of the war. The Greek disaster delayed Barbarossa. The Italian surrender opened up a new front in Italy that tied down German forces. The collapse of Italian colonialism contributed to post-war decolonization movements. And the memory of fascist incompetence and betrayal would shape Italian politics for generations. In the end, Italy's betrayals in World War II stand as a warning about what happens when political ambition vastly exceeds national capability, when ideology trumps strategic realism, and when short-term political survival becomes the only guiding principle of statecraft.